Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A People's History of the American Revolution: How Common People Shaped the Fight for Independence, by Raphael. Narrated by Paul Heitsch. The research for A People's History of the American Revolution was made possible, in part, by a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Forward. The libraries are bursting with books on the American Revolution, but not one like this. The publishers and the public never seem to tire of the same old story. The great battles, the military heroes, the wisdom of the Founding Fathers. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, as I write this, are subjects of best-selling biographies. Multi-volume sets of their papers and those of the other leaders are being published. It is an approach to history which, in every society, serves the interests of the privileged and powerful, because by ignoring ordinary people, it reinforces their feelings of powerlessness. We are not surprised when the narratives given to the public in totalitarian states deify the leaders and reduce the citizenry to ciphers. But we are startled when it is suggested to us that in liberal democratic states, such as ours, boasting freedom of expression and a pluralism of ideas, there is a similar exaltation of leaders, with everyone else barely visible. Surely it is time to break with that habit in the interests of democracy, and Raphael gives us a good start. Howard Zinn. Series Preface. Turning history on its head opens up whole new worlds of possibility. Once, historians looked only at society's upper crust, the leaders and others who made the headlines and whose words and deeds survived as historical truth. In our lifetimes, this has begun to change. Shifting history's lens from the upper rungs to the lower, we are learning more than ever about the masses of people who did the work that made society tick. Not surprisingly, as the lens shifts, the basic narratives change as well. The history of men and women of all classes, colors, and cultures reveals an astonishing degree of struggle and independent political action. Everyday people played complicated historical roles, and they developed highly sophisticated and often very different political ideas from the people who ruled them. Sometimes their accomplishments left tangible traces. Other times the traces are invisible, but no less real. They left their mark on our institutions, our folkways and language, on our political habits and vocabulary. We are only now beginning to excavate this multifaceted history. The New Press People's History series will roam far and wide through human history, revisiting old stories in new ways and introducing altogether new accounts of the struggles of common people to make their own history. Taking the lives and viewpoints of common people as its point of departure, this series will re-examine subjects as different as the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the Cold War, the settlement of the New World, World War II, and the American Civil War. A People's History does more than add to the catalog of what we already know. These books will shake up readers' understanding of the past, just as common people throughout history have shaken up their always changeable worlds. Howard Zinn, Boston, 2000. Introduction. Real people, not paper heroes, made and endured the American Revolution. Witness. In September of 1776, when the Reverend Ami R. Robbins was making his rounds among patients of the Continental Army, he came upon one very sick youth from Massachusetts who asked the Reverend to save him because he felt he was not fit to die. "Do, sir, pray for me," pleaded the youth, whose name and age were not reported. "Will you not send for my mother? If she were here to nurse me, I could get well. Oh, my mother, how I wish I could see her. She was opposed to my enlisting. I am now very sorry. Do let her know I am sorry." Robbins did not send for the boy's mother. Instead, he endeavored to point him to the only source of peace, prayed, and left him. He cannot live long. In 1773, as white patriots complained they were being reduced to a state of slavery, 4 African Americans from Massachusetts petitioned a member of the Assembly. "Sir, the efforts made by the legislative of this province in their last sessions to free themselves from slavery gave us, who are in that deplorable state, a high degree of satisfaction. We expect great things from men who have made such a noble stand against the designs of their fellow men to enslave them." The slaves were only requesting 1 day a week to labor for themselves, but the Assembly took no action. Lydia Minturn Post, a Long Island housewife with strong patriotic feelings, was forced to quarter some Hessian troops during the British occupation. When the Hessians received their monthly ration of rum, the hostess wrote, "We have trying and grievous scenes to go through, fighting, brawls, drumming and fifing and dancing the night long, card and dice playing, and every abomination going on under our very roofs. Whether drunk or not, the soldiers would take the fence rails and burn, so that the fields are left open, and the cattle stray away and are often lost, burn fires all night on the ground, and to replenish them, go into the woods and cut down all the young saplings, thereby destroying the growth of ages." What bothered Lydia the most, however, was that the Hessians made baskets for her daughters and taught German to her son. "The children are fond of them," she conceded. "I fear lest they should contract evil." In June of 1776, 15-year-old Joseph Plum Martin threatened to run off and board a privateer if his grandparents did not allow him to enlist in the army. Despite some misgivings, he wanted someday to come swaggering back to tell tales of his hairbreadth escapes. All his older friends were signing up, and Joseph did not wish to be left behind. I one evening went off with a full determination to enlist at all hazards. When I arrived at the place of rendezvous, I found a number of young men of my acquaintance there. The old bantering began. "Come, if you will enlist, I will," says one. "You have long been talking about it," says another. "Come, now is the time." Thinks I to myself, I will not be laughed into it or out of it. I will act my own pleasure after all. But what did I come here for tonight? Why, to enlist. Then enlist I will. So seating myself at the table, enlisting orders were immediately presented to me. I took up the pen, loaded it with the fatal charge, made several mimic imitations of writing my name, but took special care not to touch the paper with the pen, until an unlucky wight who was leaning over my shoulder gave my hand a stroke which caused the pen to make a woeful scratch on the paper. "Oh, he has enlisted," said he. "He has made his mark. He is fast enough now." Well, thought I may as well go through with this business now as not. So I wrote my name fairly upon the indentures. And now I was a soldier, in name at least, if not in practice. Dr. Abner Beebe of East Haddam, Connecticut, was known to speak very freely in favor of the Crown. Although he had committed no other crime, he was assaulted by a mob, stripped naked, and hot pitch was poured upon him, which blistered his skin. He was then carried to a hog-sty and rubbed over with hog's dung. They threw the hog's dung in his face and rammed some of it down his throat, and in that condition exposed to a company of women. His house was attacked, his windows broke, when one of his children was sick, and a child of his went in distraction upon this treatment. His grist-mill was broke, and persons prevented him from grinding at it, and from having any connections with him. 2 months before the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British sent Colonel Leslie with 240 men to seize arms and ammunition which the rebels had stored in Salem. As the troops approached town, residents halted their progress by lifting the Northfield drawbridge. Several inhabitants climbed onto the raised leaf of the bridge and engaged in a shouting match with Colonel Leslie on the other side. William Gavett, an eyewitness, reported the incident. In the course of the debate between Colonel Leslie and the inhabitants, the colonel remarked that he was upon the King's highway and would not be prevented passing over the bridge. Old Mr. James Barr, an Englishman and a man of much nerve, then replied to him, "It is not the King's highway. It is a road built by the owners of the lots on the other side, and no king, country, or town has anything to do with it." Colonel Leslie was taken aback, but he pressed the issue. James Barr held firm, knowing he was in the right. In the end, Leslie promised to march only 50 rods, without troubling or disturbing anything, if the residents of Salem would lower the bridge. The bridge came down, Leslie kept his word, and the opening battle of the American Revolution was postponed. Old James Barr had taken on the British Empire with a few simple words. Phoebe Ward of Eastchester, New York, wrote a letter to her husband, Edmund, on June 6, 1783. Kind husband, I am sorry to acquaint you that our farm is sold. They said that if I did not quit possession, that they had a right to take anything on the farm or in the house to pay the cost of a lawsuit and imprison me. I have suffered most everything but death itself in your long absence. Pray grant me speedy relief, or God only knows what will become of me and my friendless children. They say my possession was nothing. Your husband has forfeited his estate by joining the British enemy with a free and voluntary will, and thereby has forfeited to the state and sold. All at present from your kind and loving wife, Phoebe Ward. Pray send me speedy answer. In 1780, the British General Henry Clinton, not wanting to offend the civilian population, urged his subordinates, for God's sake, no irregularities. But animosities ran strong in South Carolina, and the soldiers couldn't resist. Major James Wemyss, for instance, burned 50 houses as he marched through the northeastern part of the state. In 1781, the American governor John Rutledge issued a proclamation against plundering, while General Nathanael Greene threatened to impose the death penalty on any of his soldiers who were caught marauding. But the American calls for restraint were likewise unheeded, and the state legislature, unable to provide support for the troops, soon gave legal sanction to acts of plunder. Each side took its turn running over the terrain, destroying or consuming everything in sight. After the fighting subsided, General William Moultrie reported the net effect. A countryside that had once been filled with livestock and wild fowl of every kind was now destitute of all. It had been so completely checkered by the different parties that not one part of it had been left unexplored. Consequently, not the vestiges of horses, cattle, hogs, or deer, etc., was to be found. The squirrels and birds of every kind were totally destroyed. No living creature was to be seen, except now and then a few camp scavengers, picking the bones of some unfortunate fellows who had been shot or cut down or left in the woods above ground. This was the Revolutionary War. Soldiers who were not yet men, women who lost their houses, liberty achieved and liberty denied, a devastated landscape in the South, much like in the Civil War. The American Revolution was our first civil war, pitting neighbors against neighbors and splitting families apart. Much of the violence, unsanctioned by any formal military organization, took place in houses and barns and public streets. Even in some of the major battles, British troops were conspicuously absent. After the Royal Army surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, fighting continued to rage across the South as warring factions refused to lay down their arms and settle up. Once the war was over, most survivors did not wish to dwell on the myriad human tragedies which clouded the sense of victory. In the words of John Shai, much about the event called the Revolutionary War has been very painful and was unpleasant to remember. Only the outcome was unqualifiedly pleasant, so memory, as ever, began to play tricks with the event. Almost before the blood had cooled, surviving patriots turned the victims into heroes and created a whitewashed mythology eulogizing the so-called Founding Fathers. The majestic ideals of Thomas Jefferson, the persuasive words of Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine, the seasoned wisdom of Benjamin Franklin, the inspirational leadership of George Washington. Great men with great ideas were the midwives to American liberty. The rebels had dumped tea, issued declarations, and killed a few redcoats who deserved their fates. But they had inflicted no mass carnage. Americans preferred to believe that their nation was conceived in an epiphany of Republican glory. The leaders of the new nation had a particular interest in selective memory as they utilized patriotic fervor to forge a viable union. According to historian Charles Royster, Charles Thompson, the longtime Secretary of Congress, probably knew more about the administration and politics of the Revolutionary War than any other American, but he refused to publish a history of the Revolution. "I could not tell the truth without giving great offense. Let the world admire our patriots and heroes, their supposed talents and virtues, where they were so, by commanding imitation, will serve the cause of patriotism and our country." According to another version of his refusal, he concluded by saying, "I shall not undeceive future generations." Before he died, Thompson burned his papers. Americans of later generations have commandeered the Revolution. When workers tried to form a labor party in 1829, they pleaded, "Awake then from your slumbers, and insult not the memories of the heroes of '76 by exhibiting to the world that what they risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to obtain, you do not think worth preserving." When Philadelphia laborers went on strike in 1835 for the 10-hour day, they distributed a circular. "We claim, by the blood of our fathers, shed on the battlefields in the War of the Revolution, the rights of American citizens." In a very different cause, William L. Yancey of Alabama called for the white people of the South in 1860 to fight once again for their independence, to produce spirit enough to call forth a Lexington, to fight a Bunker's Hill. After Lincoln was elected president that same year, Confederates in South Carolina tried to form a group of Minutemen to go to Washington and prevent the inauguration. A century later, right-wing anti-communists once again invoked memories of the Revolution as they organized their own groups of Minutemen. In the American mind, the outcome of the Revolution has always overshadowed the event itself. In 1958, Henry Steele Comacher and Richard B. Morris concluded their monumental compilation of primary sources with telling remarks. The American Revolution was costly in lives and in property, and more costly in the terror and fear and the violence that, as in all wars, fell so disproportionately on the innocent and the weak. Yet, by comparison with other wars of comparable magnitude, before and since, the cost was not high. Notwithstanding the ruthlessness and even the ferocity with which it was waged, it did little lasting damage and left few lasting scars. Population increased all through the war. The movement into the West was scarcely interrupted, and within a few years of peace, the new nation was bursting with prosperity and buoyant with hope. Independence stimulated both material and intellectual enterprise. Of few other wars can it be said that so much was gained at so little lasting cost, either in lives snuffed out or in a heritage of hatred. In fact, a greater percentage of the American population perished in the Revolutionary War than in World War I, World War II, or the Vietnam War. Only the Civil War was more deadly. Even now, popular images of the Revolution continue to focus on its legacy rather than on the war itself. The past serves as a mirror to reflect present agendas. Conservatives see the Revolution as a noble struggle against an intrusive government, a precedent and implicitly a justification for their own anti-government leanings. Liberals view the Revolution as a critical step towards political democracy and social equality. Radicals tend to focus on the failure of the revolution to achieve those same objectives, particularly with respect to women, African Americans, and Native Americans. Hardcore realists, meanwhile, treat our so-called War of Independence as one more chapter in mankind's struggle for dominance and power, same as it ever was. For each and every political orientation, the American Revolution, always flexible, is there to offer support. Rhetoric and ideology were paramount in our nation's founding. They remain so today as we try to discover who we are by examining our roots. But what about the people themselves? Behind the myths, concealed by all the political agendas and self-serving talk, lie flesh and blood human beings, our real-life founding fathers and founding mothers, too. Who were these people? That is what I wish to explore in this book. That very term, the people, is suspect. More often than not, it serves as an invitation to yet more rhetoric. Then, as now, the people were many and varied. They were citizens turned soldiers, both men and boys, some who fought eagerly in the name of liberty, others who joined the army for lack of better alternatives. They were women, some widowed, some who cooked and washed for the troops, many who stayed at home to tend to business while the men went to war. They were African Americans who sought their freedom in any way they could, by writing petitions, serving in the army as substitutes for whites who had been drafted, or escaping to fight with the British, but who, for the most part, remained slaves at war's end, subjected to treatment at least as harsh as before. They were Native Americans, a few siding with the Patriots, more siding with the British, who either joined or resisted alliances in search of their own sovereignty, much like the rebellious colonists. They were Loyalists, who endured a merciless persecution. Citizens from all locations and classes, their loyalty based sometimes on a pure sense of allegiance, often on self-interest or prior antagonisms with the local patriot leadership. They were neutrals, Quakers and Moravians opposed to all wars, people from various walks of life who saw no particular advantage in joining either side, and countless nameless individuals from that great mass of humanity which, throughout history, has tried to overlook public affairs in favor of private pursuits. They were city dwellers, bakers, cobblers, joiners, laborers, seamen, who took active roles in meetings and demonstrations and who filled the musters, either willingly or not, of local militias. They were farmers, mostly small, who left their animals and crops to fight in the militias for short periods of time, or who managed to stay at home, leaving the fighting to others. They were lawyers and merchants, local elites who tried to call the shots, some serving as political representatives or military officers, some profiteering from wartime shortages and inflation. They were slave-holding planters who held their world together with violence disguised as gentility, and who struggled, some consciously, others not, with the basic contradiction of waging a war in the name of freedom while denying freedom to others. They were victimizers and victims, men who started the war, other men who fought the war, men and women alike who died or suffered. They were true believers and non-believers, and many who had to compromise their patriotic ideals in the struggle for material survival as the war wreaked havoc on the domestic economy. These and more were the faces of the American Revolution. In particular, I wish to explore what the Revolution meant for the common people of the times, the men and women who did not enjoy the special privileges afforded by wealth, prestige, or political authority. The surfeit of attention given to famous personalities has eclipsed the stories of lesser-known folk and falsely skewed the telling of the Revolutionary War. A simple shift of the lens from George Washington to his slaves, to the soldiers he commanded, to the Indians he displaced, reveals incidents and events facts and figures, portraits and personalities of great historical significance. It is time to replace, or at least supplement, the traditional picture of the Revolution with an elaborate mosaic of new scenes and different characters. This is beginning to happen. Historians today are breaking down the amorphous mass of revolutionary America into more discrete groups as they try to understand how the idiosyncrasies of location, class, race, relationship, and gender colored the revolutionary experience. Farm wives and shoemakers and slaves and tenant farmers are finally being given their due. When we look into forgotten corners, we find evidence that helps us deconstruct and reconstruct the American Revolution. There was more to it than Bunker Hill, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and Benedict Arnold's betrayal. Once we make the simple decision to include common people, we are forced to rewrite the story. Late in the summer of 1774, more than half a year before the shot heard round the world, tens of thousands of plain farmers seized political authority from Crown-appointed officials in all of Massachusetts outside Boston. Hats in hand, judges and members of the Governor's Council resigned their posts. Muskets in tow, the farmers took over. This was the true beginning of the American Revolution. The later battles at Lexington and Concord constituted a counter-revolution, as the British tried to regain control of a countryside they had previously lost. Few of the patriots who cried so loudly about taxation without representation bore arms for more than brief periods of time. Buying their way out and hiring substitutes, those with property to protect left the fighting to poor men and boys with no farms or businesses of their own. Militiamen deserted by the droves. Continental soldiers mutinied for lack of food and pay. While some women spun for the cause of liberty or gave up their tea, others devoted their lives to service in the Continental Army. Although most camp followers, as they were called, joined the revolution for lack of other alternatives, these poor women contributed more than their share as they starved and froze and fell ill along with the soldiers. In Maryland, Delaware, New York, and the southern backcountry, many struggling farmers fought their own revolution against the patriot elite. It was a time to rise up and rebel, but not all the rebelling was directed against the British. Sometimes, when the rich called themselves patriots, the poor became loyalists in response. Some 80,000 people, 1 in every 30 free Americans, belonged to pacifistic communities: Quakers, Shakers, Moravians, Mennonites, Amish, Dunkers, Schwenkfelders, that opposed the Revolutionary War on religious grounds. The Revolution constituted the most sweeping and devastating Indian War in American history. All Native Americans east of the Mississippi were affected, and many lost their lands. The war accentuated divisions among and within the tribes as the majority sided with the Crown, the minority with the rebels. After the war, when American settlers no longer had to compete with the British, encroachment on native lands proceeded with unprecedented speed. In the South, thousands upon thousands of enslaved men and women sought freedom by fleeing to the British, while others established their own maroon communities in woods and swamps. In the North, some slaves were freed after serving in the military in place of their masters. Freedom was the name of the game, and the stakes were much higher for African Americans than for patriots who complained they were slaves to Parliament. These happenings, crucial to a comprehensive understanding of the Revolution, have been ignored in the mythic tale of our nation's founding. It is time to break from the mold. By uncovering the stories of farmers, artisans, and laborers, we discern how plain folk helped create a revolution strong enough to evict the British Empire from the 13 colonies. And by digging deeper still, we learn how people with no political standing, women, Native Americans, African Americans, altered the shape of a war conceived by others. 1. Rank and file rebels. Street action. A shoemaker's tale. Country rebellions. Frontier swagger. Politics out of doors.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?